Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear Minister Kuru, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here and to have a chance to address some of the issues that you face here in Finnish higher education, and that in addition to the questions that you raise here, also relate to international global discussions on higher education. So while there is, of course, a Finnish flavor to the questions that you address, you are in a European, regional and global setting. And from that perspective, I want to go through a number of issues that might be of relevance for your discussion. As I said, it's a great pleasure to be back here in Finland. I had the pleasure and honor to be involved in OECD review of the then polytechnic sector in 2003, a number of FinHack reviews, amongst other things, of the master degree in what was becoming the sector of Universities of Applied Sciences, as well as the review a few years ago on the emerging RDI role of the sector. But I've also been involved in working with colleagues in University of Tampere in Helsinki, working for the Academy of Finland. But that all doesn't make me a Finn. I'm an outsider. But I hope I'm an informed outsider, and that the reflections based on the academic work on higher education and science, that their reflections are of relevance. I want to address change dynamics in higher education and take as a general starting point the invitation that I got for this seminar, which focuses on two issues. There are countries, higher education systems outside Finland, and there's a lot of world outside Finland, so it covers a lot of geographical areas. But there are countries that are regarded as successful. Can we say anything about the factors that have made them successful when it comes to higher education and science? And from these experiences and reflections and analysis of success factors of other countries, what are questions that the Finnish policy debates with respect to higher education should address? My starting point is, as the chairman was also referring to, my own work on higher education and higher education policy. I'm a political scientist by training, so I'm interested in the political governance of higher education, where the framework conditions for higher education are created at various levels. In our part of the world, we have a supranational governance level. What is discussed and to some extent decided in Brussels is of relevance for all the member states, plus a number of countries like Norway that are closely linked to the EU. But within our countries, we have a government level, we have ministry level, we have agencies, and we have what is called the knowledge space level. That is where you find the higher education institutions, research institutes, etc. So what's happening in this political governance, and what kind of framework conditions lead to what kind of outcomes? That is my starting point. What does research on higher education tell us? What kind of lessons can we learn from it? This year I've celebrated my 30th anniversary in higher education research in academia. 15 years in the Netherlands, 15 years in Norway. So now before the end of this month I have to decide where I want to spend the next 15 years. But what I've learned from this 30 years and what is being discussed also in parts of the academic literature is that first, yes, there is a converging set of ideas that one finds in higher education reform agendas around the world. We've been referring to it as a kind of global script for higher education. And when I was still at CHAPS, the Center for Higher Education Policy Studies, we strongly believed that converging reform agendas will lead to converging higher education systems. So there was, in the 1990s, a strong conviction that because of the growing similarities in reform agendas, we were going to see the next 20 years, the 90s, the 2000s, converging higher education system. Hasn't happened. If you look around the world or closer to the European Union and the way that higher education systems have developed, in many respects, there are diverging change dynamics. But not just between systems, also within systems. And I can give later on a number of examples of it. So it means that there are no prescriptions. There's no simple or more complex recipe to follow, a set of measures to introduce, and then you have a successful higher education system. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. There are all kinds of reasons. And one is referring to one of the most effective German politicians, Otto von Bismarck, that policies and laws like sausages cease to inspire respect in proportion as we know how they are made. So he made the comparison between the two, but he also said politics concerns the understanding of the possible. And what is possible in the US might not be possible in Finland. What is possible in Finland might not be possible in, for example, the Netherlands. So we got to keep that in the back of our mind. Policies are not rational. There are all kinds of, at least not in a philosophical kind of way. Policies have to focus on what is possible and what is realizable. A second aspect that we have to take into account is that a university is a very complex institution with a very long history. There are very clear rules of behavior within the university that aren't written down anywhere, but that are part of the culture of the institution that one has to take into account. But there's also a clear aspect, a clear characteristic of the university, and the term university in this respect refers, of course, to all higher education institutions, is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to predict the outcomes of the activities. If you get 300 first-year students in a certain program, you cannot predict with 100% certainty where these students will be in 3 years from now. And with research, it's even clearer. We can compare it to an apple tree. You don't know what the harvest is going to be. There's going to be a harvest, but you can't predict that harvest. So we get to keep this institutional complexity of the university in mind, but it also implies that it doesn't respond to reforms in the way that is often assumed in the underlying ideas and assumptions with respect to the reforms. Now let's look at a number of data to get a first kind of indication of success. Where are we and the nature of success? The Shanghai ranking, as you know, was introduced by a university in Shanghai with the funding from the Chinese government, because the Chinese government had a very ambitious policy. By 2020, it wanted 30 of its universities to be part of the 100 best universities of the world. There was only one problem. Well, there were a number of problems, but at least one problem was no one could tell the Chinese government what the 100 best universities of the world were. There was no global ranking. So this university got funding to develop a global ranking. And one of the advantages of this ranking compared to many others is that at least they've used the same indicators year after year after year. So you can compare, for example, 2003 with 2014, which is impossible with most other rankings because they change their indicators regularly. But what we see here is a remarkable stability. There's still no Chinese university among the 100 best in the world, and time runs out for the Chinese government. So I don't know how realistic it still is to assume that by 2020 there will be 30 Chinese universities among the 100 best in the world. But you see a remarkable stability. There are fewer universities from the US, a few more from Europe. The Japanese have kind of swapped places with the Australian universities, but for the rest, it's Europe, it's Northern America, Australia, Japan. That's where you find the top universities in the world, at least when you take the criteria from the Shanghai ranking that also the Chinese government is highly emphasizing as a starting point. So remarkable stability. We have a European Champions League of Research, the ERC, the European Research Council. Only one criteria, in essence, for selecting research projects for funding, and that's scientific quality. Geographical position or geographical location of the researcher in question doesn't matter, and you see the consequences. A huge concentration, 5 countries. Host at the moment almost 2/3 of all researchers that have an ERC grant. And of these 5 countries, Germany and France are somewhat underperforming, and the UK is somewhat overperforming, but 2 of the countries that are also in the study that the minister was referring to, the Netherlands and Switzerland, are doing remarkable well here. What is also clear is that we have a challenge in Europe. If you look at the quality of research in the Central and Eastern European countries, which have together 71 grants, which is far less than the top universities in Europe have. So there are a number of universities that have more ERC ERC-funded projects than the whole of Central and Eastern Europe together. But you see here also the usual suspects. You'll find them back in the rankings, even though there's not a one-to-one link, of course. But you see what kind of countries host the universities that are playing in the European Champions League for research. It's Britain, it's Switzerland, it's the Netherlands, it's Israel. That's part of the countries that are funded through the framework programs. And it's then 1 in Germany, 1 in Finland, and 1 in Belgium. So you see the concentration of research, if you take only scientific quality as a starting point, is remarkable in a few countries and in a few universities. When it comes to the data on how much is a country investing in R&D, then Switzerland, but also Finland and a number of other countries in Europe are at the top. You can't go much further, at least if you compare it on a global scale, than what Finland is already investing in R&D. And also when you look at where does FP7 funding, where is it invested? And you see that Finland is one of the few countries that is doing well as a country. There are no regions in Finland, at least according to the way in which regions were defined here, where the success rate in FP7 is lower than 60% of the European average. And in every other country, there are a number of regions where the success rate is lower than 60%. Of course, as said, it depends on how you define region, etc. But with all of these data, they give indications of where one might find successful regions or countries or systems or institutions. And we could go on and on and on presenting these data. But what I want to do is not stick too much to these data like citation index and what does it say, etc., but go to these success factors that I've also discussed in the background report. These are the factors that are discussed and determined within the political governance of higher education. The level of institutional autonomy, the nature of system governance and the system structure, how is public funding for R&D invested, and the notion of prestige economy. And I'll come back to the knowledge base at the end. Let's start with autonomy, a core concept once again. But we have to realize autonomy is related to the Steenoog's quest. You can find it in any society, anywhere in the world, the Steenoog's quest for the perfect balance between the level of government control and the level of autonomy of the units, the institutions within society. So on the one hand, the need for a system-level order, a certain level of control over what's going on in society, and on the other hand, a need for autonomy in order to achieve certain outcomes. And what is crucial here, there's no ideal situation. What seems to be the appropriate level of autonomy in our age might look very different in 20 years from now. If we go back to the 1960s, the notion of the role of the state was very different from what is emphasized now. So at any moment in time, what is seen as the ideal level of autonomy for universities and colleges and other public sector agencies is a reflection of the zeitgeist. So what is seen as the appropriate level of autonomy. And you see that this is currently an issue in Europe. These are just few of the national reforms on autonomy that have been introduced over the last 25 to 30 years. Every country has reformed the level of autonomy, reformed the relationship, authority relationship between higher education and the state in one way or another. And some countries have even had more than one autonomy reform. And the assumption underlying more recent changes in the level of autonomy are, if you give universities and other higher education institutions more autonomy, they will act strategically and they will take decisions that will lead to an effective system diversity. Institutions will find their niche. Autonomous universities are more effectively able to satisfy the needs of society and of the stakeholders, and they will carefully look at what others are doing and adjusting to it. So there are a number of assumptions, but it is a very problematic concept, autonomy. It used to relate to academic freedom and academic self-steering. And in that time, when autonomy related to the level of academic freedom and academic self-steering, it was assumed that academic frontier individuals and groups, so the top academics in the world, would be developed, would be able to come to the level of global excellence within their academic unit. That is where the incentives could be found for stimulating academic excellence. But it has changed, because now the assumption is that the only way in which academic excellence can be created, in whatever way defined, is through universities, polytechnics and other higher education institutions as organizational actors, as strategic actors. They need a certain control over their organizational structure, over personnel policies, the distribution of resources, etc. And in all the studies on autonomy that we know in Europe and elsewhere, there's a focus on this formal level of authority. So how much of the responsibility for funding, for personnel, for strategic decision-making is transferred from the ministry to the institutions. There's very little interest in and empirical studies on what's going on inside the institutions. So what is the interpretation of autonomy and how is it used to stimulate, amongst other things, academic excellence as well as socioeconomic relevance? Why are certain universities more active and more successful than others? So our first conclusion, and later on I will present the questions that are coming from it with respect to Finland, is that the assumption underlying reforms that enhanced institutional autonomy will naturally lead to a more successful higher education system is far too simple. It is not only about moving authority from the ministry to the institutions. And a very interesting set of studies was done in the 1980s in the US, is one example by Frederick Volkmine, who, on the basis of his analysis of changes in a large number of states in the US, came to the conclusion that autonomy is a political concept. You can increase autonomy of higher education institutions without any effect on the quality of the primary processes, education and research. And quality is an economic concept. So if you want to increase quality, don't look at autonomy, but look at funding. Second, higher education system structure, a very important aspect. How is your higher education system organized? And here we can say that a large number of higher education studies throughout at least 50 years show that market forces do not produce a diversified higher education system. If you leave it to the market, you will get something what is called a snake-like procession. Already in '56, Riesman, one of the most prominent and most cited higher education scholars in the US, was pointing to the fact that in the US, already at that time, higher education was functioning like a snake. Those institutions who were in the middle of the body of the snake were carefully looking at the top and trying to imitate the top. Those who were in the tail were trying to imitate the body. And the consequence was that the snake became more and more headless and tailless, only a body. So how can you prevent, if you want to have a snake-like higher education system with a clear structure, like a snake with certain functions in the first part of the body, other functions in the middle and other in the tail, how can you prevent that the snake becomes a formless creature? One of the discussions that's going on in Europe is what are we going to do with our binary systems? We've, since the 60s, assumed that we can put the universities in one sector and the universities of applied science, polytechnics, colleges, Fachhochschulen in another sector. And we keep them separated, and we expect that they will develop within their sector. And we all know that it worked in the beginning, but it doesn't necessarily work anymore. So what kind of diversity challenge is Finland facing? Is it necessary and adequate to go in the direction of elite institutions, or in the direction of centers of excellence? So in other terms, what fits the Finnish society best? A system which is stratified. Stratified meaning growing interinstitutional differences, either still in a binary system, so more differences between the universities and more differences between the universities of applied sciences, or in an integrated system, or is there a preference for a horizontal system where there's a stimulation of intra-institutional differences? So excellence is then the responsibility of all institutions, but in different meanings. And you see different answers also within Europe, different preferences of different systems for either of the two diversity solutions. Third component, very important and often debated, but there are a number of elements lacking in the way in which it is debated usually. That is, how do we use our funding, public funding, first and foremost for research? Is it dispersed or is it concentrated? The US is also there an important frame of reference. And there you see the development that in the 1950s, the public funding for research through the National Science Foundation and National Institution of Health was concentrated heavily in 15 to 20 universities. So a large part of the funding from the NSF was concentrated, and the number of institutions that was successful in the competition, that was formally at the state and national level recognized as top research-intensive universities, grew to 30-40 in the 1960s, but the share that the first top 15 to 20, the most distinguished institutions, the share of the research funding that went to these institutions was still growing. So there was no worry about quality. So the dispersion was seen as something positive. But in the 1970s and 80s, when the public budgets of the NSF and the National Institution of Health were more than doubling, the relative share of the top universities was decreasing. So there was a worry that the opening up of the competition for more universities was leading to a reduction in quality. So if you spread your public funds for research over a larger number of institutions, and the share that is going to your top institutions is decreasing, does it mean then that the quality of research is threatened? And the general discussion in the US, also by a lot of institutional representatives, was yes, it will, and it has affected the quality. But the analysis by a large number of researchers, Geiger, Feller, De Groot and this team, and others show that a very important principle became a reality in American top universities, and that is capacity exhaustion. The top universities had reached the maximum of what they could produce. So there was no way in which the capacity could be increased without reducing the quality. So the conclusion there was that the public and private top universities had to a large extent exhausted their product-specific scale economies when it comes to graduate enrollment and research. So they couldn't increase further their capacity for handling doctoral students. They couldn't increase their capacity for doing top research. They had reached their maximum. So it was like you go to a wedding, and you can perhaps have experienced it, and champagne is poured. Every now and then you see these hills of glasses on top of each other. It poured into the top glass, and gradually it goes to all the glasses, and in the end all the glasses are full. So the American dispersion of public academic funding can be compared to that. The top glass is full, and then it goes to the next level of glasses, and then the next level of glasses. Well, in Europe, we've been more used to all the glasses next to each other, and we begin to pour the glasses on the left, and we stop halfway because we're not sure whether we have enough champagne to fill all the glasses, and in the end, all the glasses might be half full. So we have to look at this carefully and to discuss whether, also in the Finnish case, you've achieved a capacity exhaustion in your research universities, and if not, what are the consequences of that? When you come to Europe, what is of importance when it comes to the dispersion of research funding is the three science policy pillars in the very clearly visible in Horizon 2020. Focusing on research that's curiosity-driven, the excellent science pillar. We don't know what we don't know. A quote from Helga Nowotny, the previous president of the ERC. And therefore, we got to invest in curiosity. In the investments made, there's no expectation of any form of return or any form of innovation. We invest because we have to strengthen our knowledge base. Then there's the part that addresses the grand challenges, where, in addition to what the director of the University of Eastern Finland emphasized, there is a great need to find solutions, but there's also a great need to get a better understanding of the actual challenges. So that is, this combination is clearly part of this pillar of FP7 and contributing to economic growth, job creation, innovation by strengthening the competitiveness of the industrial sector. So here are the three pillars. There's not a very clear relationship between the three, and there's growing expectations about, but also frustration with the university's performance in the third pillar, and that is driving a large part of the debate. So we got to take a step back in Europe and much more clear than we've done until now, identify which institutions, also in higher education, are expected to contribute to which kind of underlying dimension of the three pillars. So which institutions are able to contribute to our need for more curiosity-driven research, as well as the other two pillars. Briefly, patterns in RDI policies and practices. I assume also Jack Sparpen will refer to that when it comes to the Netherlands. But what is interesting is that there's a dramatic change in the way in which innovations have been created in the US. And it's important to realize what is the role of all the actors in stimulating innovation. I won't go into detail. Again, it's important to look at this literature because it provides some kind of counter argument for the often emphasized assumption that the private sector knows how to pick winners and the public sector and the state doesn't know how to pick winners. As discussed in Matsukuto's book from last year, in any innovation system, a core actor is the entrepreneurial state. There's no other actor that is willing to handle the level of uncertainty related to the innovation process. And it also has a consequence for the role of universities. This quote by Matsukuto, which I've also presented in the background report, is clearly indicating that we shouldn't misinterpret the way in which in the US universities and the private sector each have their own role in the innovation process. The universities, much more than in Europe, have a role in producing knowledge, and private sector has a role in applying early stage technologies. So in Europe we have a tendency of mixing the two and assuming that the universities and university colleges can do both. We have to look very carefully at that. What is it that we realistically can expect of a higher education institution when it comes to the innovation processes? Finally, prestige economy, a very important term. It relates to the way in which growing competition for external funding affects the internal processes in universities and colleges. So Sheila Slaughter and her colleagues in the US use the term academic capitalism to refer to the behavior of academic staff that has to compete more and more for external funding, especially for research, but also for tuition fee funding. And they are more and more forced to sell their knowledge base to whatever buyer you find in the environment. So your expertise becomes a basis for a form of academic capitalism. And in the earlier version of academic capitalism, it was assumed that it doesn't matter what the source of external funding is, because academics are willing and have to develop their own version of capitalism towards the ones who are providing the funding, whether it's for research or for education. But more recent in-depth research in a large number of universities in the US, American colleagues, and we cooperate with them in a number of projects. They have data from about 1,400 higher education institutions, clearly show that not all external funds for your internal academic activities have the same preference. Some external funds are preferred over others. And this leads to a kind of prestige economy with consequences for the internal organization of universities and colleges. And in essence, you can say that external funds for research, and certainly for academic research, are preferred over external funds for teaching. And what it means in the US is a growing internal segmentation, where you see high prestige units, high prestige departments, and low prestige departments. And the high prestige departments, usually the ones in the natural sciences, technology, life sciences, they are driven by a kind of competitive logic where the whole department is aimed at least maintaining the level of external funding for research. And the university appreciates it because success in external funding contributes to a large extent to the status and prestige of the university, and income from tuition fee and other educational-based income is used to stimulate this competitive logic within the departments that are successful. So what you see in the departments that have difficulties of attracting external funding for research is that they are more and more underlying a kind of administrative logic where the administration determines personnel policies, a number of positions, the use of resources, etc. So there in these departments you see a replacement of tenured professors by lecturers and all kinds of other dynamics which reflect this internal segmentation. In order to keep the status as a global top university, this prestige economy drives the universities to use their educational income to subsidize their efforts to be successful in external competition for research funding. Do we see the same effects in Europe? To some extent. There's a difference, of course, in Europe when it comes to the funding reality of public higher education. While in the US, already in most states, more than 85% of the budget of public higher education institutions comes from other sources than the state authority. In Europe, the basic grant is still relatively stable between 50 and 80%. But there is a similarity. Also in Europe, we see this growing emphasis of external funding for research with high prestige attached to it and possibilities for those who are successful in competition for funding. The diverging trend is still when it comes to the funding of education, which hasn't given in European universities the administration full control over the educational activities. There's a very different role of tuition fee in Europe than it is in the US, at least in continental Europe. But also in Europe, external research funding reflects a higher prestige than external educational funding. For example, the Norwegian funding system, public funding system for higher education has a large performance component. 25% of the public budget for higher education is distributed on the basis of performance in education. So your credit points produced as a university or university college lead to income, 25% of the whole budget. And it's an open system. So if you increase your credit point production with 10%, your income will go up with 10%. The performance component linked to research covers 15% and is closed. There's a fixed budget and is distributed on the basis of a number of performances, number of academic publications, number of PhD candidates, number of grants awarded by EU and the National Research Council. And there, if your production goes up with 60%, but your competition has gone up with 80%, you lose money. All the universities focus almost exclusively on this 15% because it gives prestige. So there's hardly any interest to increase the credit point productivity and to improve the quality of education despite this incentive, income incentive, but there's a great prestige-driven focus on the performance component linked to research. And it's not the only example. So it's a global phenomenon where prestige is driving a large part of the internal activities. What does it mean for the internal organization? We don't see in Europe the segmentation between departments, where some departments profit in a way from their success in external funding and others are regarded as losers. We see an administrative logic when it comes to education, but not in the distribution of resources, but in an intensifying of rules, regulations, and procedures. Education in European universities and university colleges is more and more controlled by and driven by administrative logics. And you see a competitive logic on the research side where increased autonomy of universities and university colleges means that those staff members that are successful in the external funding for research can negotiate their own room to maneuver. So the most prestigious external resources, and ERC is in most institutions at the top, allow those who got an ERC grant to negotiate and stay out of this administrative logic reality. They can create their own units, their own procedures, and in many cases, these top researchers manage to negotiate also a reduction of their educational responsibility, if not a complete withdrawal from any educational responsibility. So you see a tendency going in the same direction as in the US, but overall, there's no uniform trend. There are differences between European countries when it comes to the extent to which this prestige economy has led to segmentation within the institution. One example of how complex the notion of stimulating prestige external funding is given by this couple. They're from the University of Trondheim in Norway, and they're doing research in the area of neuropsychology. They've been getting their PhD from the University of Oslo in the early 1990s, and were looking for space to do their research, which was focused on the internal GPS system of human beings. How do we know where we are, and how do we know how to move and come back to where we left? The University of Oslo didn't have any space. They needed a laboratory, but they found space at the University of Trondheim, a relatively small university from the body of the Norwegian and European academic snake, ranked somewhere 300 to 400 in the Shanghai ranking, a good technical university, but not a traditional top university. But earlier this, and they got lots of money from the Research Council, from the university, not involved in education, not at all. In their labs are in the medical faculty. There's a lot of kind of tension because they get a lot of money and attention and freedom. But that completely stopped when they got the Nobel Prize for physiology or medicine a few weeks ago. Now suddenly the Nobel Prize is the institution's Nobel Prize. Everyone in Norwegian higher education is certainly interested in how can a university like Trondheim create an environment that produces two Nobel Prize winners, and in a very prestigious area and in a young age. They're in their early 50s. So there's been a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and the ministry has already taken a number of measures to follow this up. So first of all, some questions. What, not just these successful or highly talented researchers, but how can you interpret the careers and successes of these researchers? And how did NTNU manage to support and keep these research talents? And what does this success story provide lessons, what kind of lessons does it provide for Finnish higher education? Now, this group is very atypical. The ministry in Norway, like anywhere in the world, is emphasizing high productivity. So you want your PhD students to finish in time. You want your academic researchers to publish as much as possible. You don't want temporary positions in academia, at least not in the Nordic countries. You try to avoid that. And this group shows the opposite characteristics. A very high number of temporary positions. They have 80 people in their group now from all over the world, and 80% have a temporary position. The average time to graduate for the doctoral students in the group has been over 6 years. And there's a very low number of academic publications per staff member in the group. But when they publish, it's in the absolute top journals. But they have been extremely successful in the competition for external research funding. The university has 7 ERC grants, and all 7 grants are in this group. And they have been extremely effective in network building and recruitment of staff. So the ministry has already decided this, if it can work in Trondheim, it should be possible to stimulate this kind of development in other universities in Norway too. So already for next year, it has earmarked 70 million Norwegian kroner as a start, with the announcement that it will be enlarged for 5 universities out of the 8 in Norway. So only 5 universities will get this funding for creating structures that will support top research in the 5 universities. And this creates a huge challenge for any university, not just in Europe, but anywhere in the world. Because we are in a regime, as I referred to earlier, where it's assumed that the university as an organization, as a strategic actor, will be able to create the environments that will, amongst others, stimulate excellence. But in order to do so, the universities have to account for the way in which they use their autonomy, and they have to satisfy expectations which are measured on the basis of indicators which emphasize, amongst other things, high level of publication. So a debate around this can also be heard in a country like the Netherlands, where at the dean level, the question is, should I stimulate all my staff to produce an X number of publications each year, because that is regarded externally as a sign of academic quality, or should I have the freedom to make a distinction between, let's say, the majority of my staff who are in a kind of normal career pattern and have to link maybe most of these academic challenge or grant challenges and industrial competitiveness components of the research policy. And I have to use my own personal judgment as a dean or as a university rector to identify where do I have the talents in my university. Those people that maybe do not want to produce 3, 4, 5 international articles per year, but only want to produce when they have something to say. When it comes to this group in Trondheim, the rector said they were driving me nuts. Instead of having a very good article, they were saying, no, I want to be sure with 3 points after the comma that we are correct, and it might take 3 more years before we're there, so you got to give us that space. Now, the university could have said, you will not get that space because this is not the way in which we are supposed to operate. And this group wanted to leave the university, but the university realized this is the way to go. Okay. Knowledge base, a very important question. What do we know about the change dynamics of higher education? This is a fantastic example. In the US, the Carnegie Commission did a study, 1970s, 1980s, a 4-year study, which had a major influence on policy decisions in the decades after that. This was a large group of people which were focusing on these concerns. They produced 37 reports and with recommendations, 130 sponsored reports on all these issues. Very detailed, very thorough. We need something like that in Europe too. Okay? Finally, quickly, the questions. That's what you all have been waiting for. So, first question, where can and should institutional autonomy be enhanced, and where can and should it be reduced in Finland? The last part might not be something you want to hear, but you can see examples also in other systems. Germany is one clear example where the level of institutional autonomy in certain areas has been reduced. And it has to do with the question if the institutional autonomy has been enhanced so much that all institutions only take care of their own interest, who takes care of the system interest? So what are the critical variables and boundary conditions for which the government should be responsible? And you can think of the system structure. The reason that in the US there is hardly any competition for status is that the structure of the system determines which institution or institutions are the flagships. And the others are not allowed to compete for status with that flagship, however difficult that is for them every now and then. The system structure. Should the Finnish higher education system be structured on a more stratified basis, increased institutional diversity, or on a horizontal basis, with equality of formal status, with an emphasis on intra-institutional diversity? And it's not that one is more effective or successful than the other. So it's not a condition that you got to have a stratified system in order to be for you to be successful. But also, how can a more diversified system, because more diversity, certainly in a large system like the Finnish one, more diversity is necessary. How can you stimulate more diversity in the sense of clearer, more discriminating institutional missions and profiles? How do you realize it? And I refer here to the system of the state of Wisconsin in the US, where you find the University of Madison, Wisconsin, as a world-class university. They introduced some kind of a version of a binary system which allowed for a huge diversity and clear roles on the basis of a negotiation and an agreement between all the stakeholders involved. So this is an interesting example, state with 5.7 million inhabitants. They have something like 26 higher education institutions, public higher education institutions, and it can provide a frame of reference for the Finnish discussion on diversity. The public funding of academic research, a large number of questions about concentration and which institutions should be eligible to compete in what kind of competition for external funding. And finally, the principle of exhaustion of institutional capacity. What does it mean and how can it be used in the Finnish context? The Finnish version of a prestige economy. What are the basic characteristics of the internal change drive in Finnish universities and universities of applied science? What kind of differentiation between academic staff members do you see there? What are the conditions under which the academic staff members of the institutions can negotiate for a larger room to maneuver? And what forms of segmentation do we see? And finally, the effective institutional leadership and administration, linked also to this Norwegian example. So how can Finnish higher education institutions prevent that a more professional leadership and administration turns into a less effective leadership and administration? More professional, but less effective. And the reason to put these two as opposites is a project that I'm involved in at the moment, looking at European flagship universities in 8 countries. We also look at Australia and the US. Interviewed about 200 professors in these universities, and practically all of them is emphasizing the same. Yes, we have a more effective administration, a more professional administration, but it's less effective than what we need. So how can you prevent that you go in that direction in Finland too? So how to combine the professionalization of leadership and administration, more formalized, more standardized, more specialized, with the flexibility that is needed to allow for effective handling of diversification in external needs, external expectations, external resources, as well as allow for more internal diversification, including the protection and support of the highly talented academics. Thank you very much for your attention.